welcome to PipeGen Live. Today's topic is going to be on the outbound pivot. So a lot of organizations that I work with when I'm speaking with sales execs, especially in the last year or two, pivoting the organization to be more sales-led because inbound leads are getting more expensive. Getting account executives to maybe self-source more of their pipeline has been a really big focus. So today what we're going to talk about is how to build a world-class outbound motion. So for those of you here, welcome. We are recording this because I know a bunch of you are going to ask this. We'll send it out afterwards. We would also love to interact with you as much as possible. So if you have a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. Feel free to drop that in. And if you want to keep up in the chat, we would love to hear from you there as well. We're going to dig into quick kind of state of outbound, what's going on, what's working, what isn't, et cetera. I'm going to introduce our panel here in a second, and then we'll end the call with a quick one-on-one interview. I want to thank two of our sponsors before digging in. One of my favorite solutions out there right now is a product called Orum. So if you guys aren't using any kind of dialer or a system like that, one of the things that I love about Orum is you can load up a list, you can customize it, add merge tags, fields, etc. And you can have 5, 6, 7 live conversations in an hour versus one, hitting the phones manually. So go check out Orum and then Zoom Info. I always like where to start with Zoom Info because you guys just like do everything now. But yeah, if you're looking for essential, data, phone numbers, emails, like stuff like that, along with the entire go-to-market tech stack, everything from sales engagement tools to conversational intelligence, et cetera, Zoom Info is definitely the one to check out. Okay, so I want to get into some of the data that we're seeing, and this is going to set up the topic and the panel that we're going to have today. There's a couple stats. This one, I don't know if you guys here on the panel have seen this before, but the one on the bottom right from Gartner, I think is the most strikingly, the one that is most worrisome. And it's that 56% of buyers categorize the software they purchase as high regret. So in other words, over half the time when B2B executives were polled, they said that they regretted purchasing the software that they purchased. And this has created an environment where buying right now has become very risky. So there's a ton of data around how the buying environment has shifted. But I think that the thing that is going to be most relevant for everyone here today, and really why not only selling is a bit harder than it was a couple of years ago, but outbound as well. Sales cycles are about 40% longer since 2020. So people are taking longer to make decisions. The number of stakeholders and deals has increased by about 25% just from last year. So now there are more people involved in deals. Typically, these are more people that we have to do outbound to, et cetera. And average deal sizes are down by about 22%. So customers are wanting to get started on more proof of concepts, pilots, smaller deals, et cetera. So what does that mean for outbound? Well, this is sort of what the world looks like for outbound right now. You have about a 1% shot at getting a reply to your cold email, of which 2/3 of those are probably going to be taking off your list or unsubscribe. And you have about a 1.5% success rate on cold calls. The big thing that we want to talk with you guys about today is what I call the top performer gap. So if I'm running an organization right now and I have account executives or SDRs that are doing outbound, how do I get double-digit reply rates? What are they doing differently? Right? How do we get more people to pick up the phone? How do we have people that can land a quality meeting out of one out of every 3 or 4 conversations versus 1 out of 50 plus? And the big thing that is sort of the foundation of what we're going to talk about today is that elite skill level, world-class enablement, and solid process, these are disproportionately rewarded in sales right now. So I want to introduce our panel, then we're going to kind of cut straight to it here. We got Kyle Vamvouris. He's CEO of a company called Vamvouris. Does a ton of different sales consulting, has worked with hundreds of companies. Jack Reilly is Principal Revenue Enablement Manager at Zoom Info. Daniel Cole is Senior Manager of Business Development at OneStream. And then we have Megan on, who has been, I think, on the show 3 or 4 times now. She's the Manager of Sales Development at Zoom Info. So let's get started on the panel portion of this. So what I want to kind of kick the first question over to you, Megan, actually, is there's really kind of 4 parts that we looked at in terms of implementing a world-class outbound motion One of the first things being culture. And what I wanted to kind of tee you up with here first is, how do you guys at Zoom Info think about the culture component of Outbound? And to kind of frame that question, I work with a lot of companies. I help them with Outbound, but as you can imagine, if they don't have a strong Outbound culture, it doesn't matter how good the training is or what we come up with or the coaching or the playbooks, if the team is not bought into doing that. So from a culture standpoint, how do you guys think about this at Zoom Info?
I think it really starts with the manager that's leading the outbound team. If the manager is not 100% bought in, excited, willing to earn their reps' trust by saying, how can I help you? What's working? What's not working? What do you suck at? What are you great at? How can we highlight the things that you're great at? How can we improve the things that you're having struggles with? And just really encouraging an environment of transparency with outbound, I think, is super important. Because say when you flash some of those stats, some reps might look at that being like, well, then why the hell do I want to go do outbound? But if you're there being able to say, I'm going to do whatever in my power to help you be successful with this motion, and you truly back that up with action and encouragement, I think that's the best thing that we can do as leaders when we're managing a team that's going after an outbound motion, is really making sure that it's not just them doing all of the hard work, but we're in the thick of it as well. Like, say, for example, when's the last time you as a manager actually did a cold call and sent that recording to your team? Like, it's bold. I haven't been an SDR for over 3 years, but sometimes even doing those small things where you're showing them I'm in this with you guys makes a world of a difference.
Yeah, it's this idea of, I call it rubbing shoulders, is what I was taught, back in the day. And if you want your reps to do more of something, leading from the front, so to speak, and getting in the pit with them and actually doing some of that can earn you a ton of respect. I know, Daniel, this is a really big part of, and feel free, Daniel, to elaborate too. Like, we worked together when you were at Monday.com. You were very successful there. You just are coming off a really great quarter at OneStream as well. So feel free to give kind of context into how your team is performing right now. But I know culture is like a very big piece of the success that you've been having. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, and shout out to my team first and foremost, because everyone absolutely crushed it in Q2, getting us to our goal, and everyone hit quota in June. So first and foremost, that all the credit goes to them. Second, though, in terms of like how we really think about our playbook, we're a very value-driven playbook. And I think when you hire great people, just our playbook is about empowering them to be able to be great on their own. And so our playbook is about being able to create filters. And I think with all the information that exists on LinkedIn, you can go in and find a million different sales tactics on LinkedIn within 5 minutes of being online. I think the big thing for us is really helping people to understand the why behind each of those, how that fits into our values as a team and as a company, and be able to use that to understand whether or not it's sustainable, whether it's scalable, whether or not it exudes value, and putting it through these filters to really create a culture that holds people accountable and ultimately collaborates with everybody to be able to find what we're looking for. So I think for us, again, it's all about sales tactics are always going to change, and they change faster and faster nowadays. You'll probably, what you're doing that is successful today won't work in 6 months from now. However, if you find the right values and the things to filter these ideas through, then you're going to consistently be able to replicate success over and over again. And that's what we care about the most.
And can we double click into that, Daniel? When we prepped for this, one thing that you shared with me I thought was really cool is you've actually sat down with your team and came up with a set of values.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Tell us more about that, because I think that's very tactical for the leaders on this call, where I think you can be so focused on process and tactics and strategies and forget about like the human component of this and what motivates people to do something for a reason that's bigger than themselves. And a big part of that for you is this value system. Can you tell that backstory around, like, one of the very first things that you did when you came on at OneStream was create values together with those team, and maybe give us an example of what one or two of those are?
Yeah, and we go through them on every single one of our huddles as well to reiterate them, which might drive them a little crazy at times. But it's the perfect reminder of like, this is why we're here, this is how we're going to do it, and this is what's going to separate us. from everybody else. So yes, I came in with my ideas of what I think my values are. And especially as we're aligning, prioritizing to what we're trying to do at OneStream. That being said, there's also a level that the only way you really get buy-in with people on your team nowadays, or maybe forever, is really by allowing them to be involved in the creation process, whether that's values or whether that's actual sales tactics. So yeah, I thought it was really important to be able to say, hey, what do we need to add to this? What is important to you? And I thought it was really interesting to see some of the additional responses, because some of the things for me, again, scalability, exuding value, putting people first, seeking to understand, but then also getting some of the feedback from them of like having fun. Like that needs to be like one of our core team values, like, and being positive and bringing things like as a collaborative environment. If we're not doing those things, then it can be incredibly demoralizing as a team. So when we really think about what we're trying to do on like a daily basis, we're going through our values and we're, hey, where are we hitting? If we're not having fun today, what can we do to spice it up? Because otherwise we're going to miss on those other elements of our culture because our mindset's not going to be right for it.
Kyle, Jack, what would you guys add?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really powerful thing for people to take away, is actually sitting down with your reps and creating values. I have a good friend of mine, his name's Adam, and he works at a large food distribution company. And he's pretty high up and has a reputation of fixing failing distribution centers. So he'll go into a distribution center that's filled with food. Oftentimes there's rotting food outside of them. The people are totally disgruntled and it's a complete mess. And I asked him, what is his process for turning that around? Because you'd think the culture has become such a shell of what it used to be, and the people are so disgruntled. How could you possibly turn around a team as opposed to just replacing the whole group? And sometimes as leaders, we can feel that way, especially if you have a sales team that hasn't been working for a really long time. The people are very upset. So he walked me through exactly what he does. And I think this applies to every sales organization, not just a distribution center. And mind you, it's a lot of low-wage workers at the distribution center. So this is a really powerful technique that totally applies. I've used it in my career. So here's what he does. First, he pulls the whole team together. Hi, I'm new. I'm here. Tell me, why do you think things are the way that they are? So he has a conversation with every person individually about what problems do they see from their lens. These are the people who are on the front lines of the work that need to be resolved. And he talks to every single person. He collects all that information, then does a team meeting where he walks through how he has prioritized fixing all of the problems that the team has brought to them. So this thing's not done right. Other people don't follow this procedure here, which causes me problems over here. Whatever they are, all of them, he lists them in priority order. And then he does the craziest thing. He actually fixes the problems. And as leaders, the best thing we can do to gain trust from the people we lead is to actually implement the feedback that they're giving us. Doesn't mean that all feedback should be treated equal. Doesn't mean you're even going to take action on all of it. But by listening to them, listing out the things that really do seem to have a measurable impact on the team's performance and executing fixes with collaboration from the team, it shows them that you care, and it does a lot of the work on turning the perspective of those people around, because they feel like there's someone in their corner operating with them to help improve the entire team's efforts.
Love it. Jack, you had mentioned something also around, and just for everyone watching, the context here, I think the buy-in piece is so important to creating a successful outbound org. We've talked about getting in the pit. We've talked about the values. We've talked about really understanding what the team needs and really advocating for your team and fixing those things. Jack, you had mentioned something around, like at Zoom Info, one of the things you guys pulled out was, hey, outbound source deals tend to have larger deal sizes, win rates, et cetera. Do you want to talk about what's some of the analysis that you guys do to really build buy-in around it?
Absolutely. I mean, surprise, surprise, Zoom Info is a data-based company, right? So we make a lot of decisions based on data. And I think when it comes to getting buy-in from the team, whether it be with the leaders or enablement or whatever it is, you have a new initiative, you got to kind of get that with them, what's in it for me. So we did an analysis actually of what outbound deals, how they perform differently from the ones that come in inbound. We found they really beat them in almost every conceivable metric. You're talking about better win rates, you're talking about ASP on the ASP side, average sales price, it's like a 10% lift. And unsurprisingly, they close at a much, much higher rate. I think it was like 3x, which isn't surprising because you're going right to power instead of dealing with like a lot of the middling decision makers that kind of you get stuck there with mid-level management, frontline management. And when you give them that why behind going and like being able to exceed your targets and exceed your numbers, I mean, we have a lot of people here that have been SDRs before. I know once you promote into a closing role, like an account executive, their favorite thing often isn't any longer going and doing outbound prospecting. But if you show them that it directly correlates to hitting their number, hitting accelerators, making more money, right? You hate to use the coin-operated phrase, but you got to show them why they're going to go put in the effort and do that thing that like maybe they feel they've graduated out of. Because our AEs do a ton of self-source meetings, ton of prospecting, and it's just built into the culture, as Megan kind of alluded to.
Love it. Okay, so we got the culture piece. The next thing that I want to kind of segue into, some of you are asking in the chat. Okay, we'll get to some of the kind of more tactical elements of the outbound motion. Okay, so I think the next thing that I want to think about is, you know, I sort of think about outbound in three kind of components. There's the skills component, and there's targeting. So how do we choose targets, what to go after? How do we segment our lists, et cetera? There's the messaging. So what are the personas that we're going after? What do we say to them? And then there's the execution of that. So how does that translate into execution over the phone, email, my sequencing strategy, et cetera? I want to start, Megan, with you again here on the targeting side of things. How do you think about with your SDRs in the outbound motion around like the options that they are given from a targeting standpoint? Because I think one of the worst mistakes, let us know if you guys relate with this in the chat, is oftentimes the guidance is, hey, here's 100 accounts, go get after it. And there isn't really a lot of thought put into like, what are the 5, 10, 15 accounts within my territory where I'm most likely to have success right now? How do you guys think about that piece at ZoomInfo?
Right. I think we already touched on it a little bit, but the importance of putting it in your reps' hands as well and encouraging them to be creative about where they're sourcing accounts from is huge. And I know every company's a little bit different in terms of maybe they're segmented by geography or company size or industry or whatever the case may be, but your reps can be a lot smarter than you think they are, especially since they're sitting in their seat every single day. They're having conversations with people every single day. And maybe some people in sales leadership, like I'm in, we haven't been actively cold calling in a hot minute, right? We can pull data for sure. We can look at win rates. We can look at the types of industries and accounts and company sizes and certain aspects that are closing. But I would really challenge people, if they are a sales leader, to lean on their team and say, if I could create you a report or a list or a campaign of any type of company within your segment, what do you think would be a good high win rate realm to go into? And sometimes I am mind blown at the things that these people come up with. They're like, is there a way to be able to go after companies that we've had engagement with over 6 months ago between October and December, who had a DocuSign sent to them but never signed, who are this employee count to this employee count, who use this certain technology? Like, is there a way for us to do that? And my answer, I always want it to be like, I don't know, maybe I can, like, let me try to figure that out. Because again, it goes back to my first point of, I want to have their back and see if there's ways that I can turn their vision into a reality. So a lot of it first comes from them. When I'm going on a one-on-one, I'm like, what are your ideas? What do you want to bring to the table? What do you want me to see if I can create for you? And then, of course, outside of that, I want to have at least 3 or 4 buckets that I know are proven, where if I tell my reps, I want you to spend an hour call blitzing through this type of segment, that I know it's going to give me a return, whether that's marketing qualified leads, whether that's go backs, former customers, completely cold companies that have been visiting our website, shameless plug on ZoomInfo, companies that have been searching for our services, right? Being able to have multiple different campaigns for them to go through and kind of filter through those on a weekly basis, I think is really important. Because if we just give them one avenue that they have to stick to, it's almost like, yes, mom, yes, dad, like I'll go do this even though I really don't want to. And then they feel like their creativity is cut off.
Yeah, it's like I feel like on one end of the spectrum, you have the coldest outreach you could possibly do, where it's like people at companies that don't know who your company is and you've never had interactions with. And then there's like a demo request on this side, and there's all of this stuff in between that's like these warmer conversations that the majority of the time ideally would be spent on that stuff in the middle.
Right.
I'll kind of open this up to the rest of you other three. From a targeting standpoint, what are some best practices, that people creating an outbound motion or running one or looking to improve it right now could think about? How can I just make sure that our effort is pointed in the right direction? What do you guys think?
So I have a couple of really actionable things people can do here. And it's also important to understand where you are as an organization, because as you start to mature as an organization and you have more complexity in the different leads that you reach out to, it becomes a lot more of an operations game. It's exactly like stuff that you've heard, like, hey, how do we reach out to lost opportunities? And what's the Venn diagram of the perfect fit? But early on, sometimes we don't have that data. And as you mature, you're going to be collecting that data and you're going to be using it to improve your outreach over time. And that's something that I don't think a lot of people achieve, but that's what you need to be working towards, is how do I improve my cold outreach over time? Here's how I'd recommend to do it. And I'll start from the very beginning, and then I'll kind of stretch this out into as you're starting to mature. So in the very beginning, the list is a critical component of your team's success. And a lot of organizations, they'll run a list in ZoomInfo, send it to the SDRs, and cross their fingers like this. And when it doesn't work out, they go, oh, what's going on? It's because we didn't invest enough time in the list. You should invest as much money and time as you can into getting the list correct. You should be using ZoomInfo to figure out what the right leads are. You should be having a human go through and verify that those leads are qualified. So then that way you have a bucket of leads that you're confident from all available external information, from literally looking at those company websites. You have a list of, let's say, 1,000 companies, just for an example, 1,000 companies where you're like, these are the companies. I know that we can sell to those companies. Some of them will get filtered out. Stuff always kind of gets in there, some junk, but we feel very confident because we've audited every single one of these. From there, then you're really enriching the people who work at those companies. So how I do it is we run that initial list into ZoomInfo. We have someone human verify that these companies are the right fit by looking at their websites and their LinkedIns. Then we match those companies in ZoomInfo to the people who work there, right? You find all of the contacts who are the right people for us to reach out to. Maybe it's a CEO, CMO, maybe there's VPs in there, whoever your targets are. You run a list of those targets, and then you give those leads to your reps. So the reps have companies that we've looked at and we're confident are the right fit. So their activities are going towards the right places. So that's really the first critical component. From there, it's about organizing leads as you're calling through them, or you're reaching out to them on LinkedIn, or you're sending cold email. You're organizing those leads based on your engagement with those leads. This is how I do it. I have a bucket for all leads that are brand new and not been touched yet. That's called open. And this would be a lead status built into your CRM. And then as you do outreach, they get moved into working. These are all of the leads we're actively reaching out to, but we haven't spoken to anybody there yet through our cold calls. They've not replied to any emails. The next is prospect. This means we spoke to them, or we got a response from an email, but we did not book a meeting. Then there's meeting booked. And then there's bad data, and then disqualified. So as your team's doing the outreach, they're putting them in these different buckets. And over time, the distribution of activity each rep is doing is going to change from primarily these cold, never been reached out to before leads. Those are those open leads, to the prospect leads, which are people who've answered the phone before, people who've replied to an email. And what you see, so to go back to the data that Jason shared in the beginning, if we cold call a random cold list, we're going to get a 5% data connect rate. That means I make 100 calls, I speak to 5 people. If you call people who've answered the phone before, all of a sudden that becomes 25 to 35%. Radically changes your math. And for those leaders in the room, that's one of the key metrics for an outbound SDR team. What's our dial to connect rate? And if I can drive that number up, then we're going to have incredible outcomes, because it completely changes the math and the volume that we're doing. So that's tactically how I would organize that. And then, of course, as you mature as an organization, the data points get a lot more complicated.
Kyle, there's two really interesting things that you brought up that they seem so simple, but I don't want to be like shamelessly plugging ZoomInfo all the time here, but realistically, like if you put a crap list in front of your team and you're trying to get buy-in, like it only takes one time for them to be like, you know what, maybe this life isn't for me. Right. So you've mentioned about having like a really solid list that's highly vetted. And then the second piece of it is you're making it easy to action. Right. So it's easy for them to go do this task that potentially they may not want to do, or, they may want to be doing other things. But if you can just get that, make it a good experience all around, that's how you start to spin up that motion. They start to enjoy it. Daniel, you talked about like actually getting enjoyment and winning together. Winning together is way more fun, right? And certainly no one likes to lose alone, never mind with a crap list that just makes it that much more painful experience.
Yeah, and Jack, I actually want to double down on what you just said, because it's really important for everyone to take this away. You want to make it easy for the SDRs to action. SDR, that function is a very operational role. You're doing the same things over and over and over again. And I love giving reps autonomy. As they're hitting their numbers, they'll open up that capacity to be more creative and try different things. But you need to know what are the actions that they need to take on a daily basis in order to hit their number. There's a relationship between activities and there's a relationship between outcomes. That relationship is so important. And if you can't sit an SDR down and say, here's how many calls you need to make, here's how many emails you need to send, here's how the call should sound, here's what the email should look like, do that and you will hit your number. If you can't confidently look at SDR and tell them that, well, then you probably shouldn't have an SDR. You need to build that level of confidence in your process where they can easily action the activities they need to in order to hit their targets. And as they become stronger performers, then you open them up so they can try different things. And that's where you find these little magic moments and different tactics that end up working really well that you can scale out with the rest of the team. But you need that foundational base. If not, everyone's going to be throwing darts in different direction, not hitting anything.
Inevitably, one of them finds that little cheat code. Right. You're talking about that. They get off to the races.
Yeah, exactly.
So the list is the strategy. It's so important. One thing I want to comment on, I can't remember her name, but she dropped in an anonymous in the Q&A. How do you create the target list? Where do you even start? We're transitioning from outbound. Let me know if you guys have something else to add to this. If you're prioritizing outbound for the first time and you've mostly done inbound, lookalike accounts are the best place to start. The number one thing that you want to make sure that you do when you're doing outbound is very, very hard, and it is extremely labor intensive, and it can be expensive if you don't do it right. So make sure that you're going after accounts that look exactly like your best customers right now. The other benefit of doing that is social proof. If I'm going outbound, I want to be able to tell them that I am working with similar manufacturers, retailers, et cetera, and be able to name drop those when appropriate. Is there anything else that you guys would recommend besides that if someone is prioritizing outbound for the first time in terms of account selection and all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I thought that was great, Jason. And if you don't have the ability to do lookalikes, then you would be creating a list on whatever criteria you can. So you look at certain industries where you've had a lot of traction and you have an industry kind of based approach there. So let's say you sell to pharma, you'd build a list of pharma companies, but I can't stress enough, before you hand that list off to somebody to do outreach, you need to sit down with that list and make sure that all of the companies in there would match some of your best customers. Right. And you might not have enough, like let's say you sell to a bunch of different verticals. I would still pick one vertical to go after, and you might not have enough companies to do like a great lookalike. It's a great place to start. And if you do, great. If not, you should build a list that you feel confident handing to the SDR. And you can have them do it. And I treat this like ripping a Band-Aid where they spend a week just qualifying the leads before they call through them all. But you need to make sure that you have that list really qualified. If not, the outreach becomes incredibly challenging.
I think, Megan, you can probably dive into this more in the BDR world, and probably Daniel, you too. But typically, you're looking at one of a couple of things, right? You're either dialing by industry and lookalike customers, right? You're going after the personas that want to hear from you, or you're doing by propensity to buy, right? These are going to be those people that are doing active research into your solution. They've hit their website, right? They have different signals they're saying, hey, reach out to me. I might be kicking off a buying cycle. And then there's some of the more nuanced targeted lists that you can do, Megan, that you were talking about before, where it's all about like making those unique plays, going after past customers, going after people that have sent the DocuSign and fell out of the funnel, all that leakage type stuff that there's actually a lot of money to be made in those. And those are usually get the best response rates if they've already engaged with you in some way.
Love it. Daniel, next question for you. So let's kind of talk about, we've talked about culture at this point. We had a ton of takeaways from a targeting standpoint around the list and the strategy around the list. Let's talk about like the actual execution. What are you seeing working with your team right now in terms of the contact strategy? So email, phone, LinkedIn, the combination of that sort of stuff, how many touches, et cetera. What are you seeing from an execution standpoint?
Yeah, I'll say one other quick thing to note as well. I know, especially in enterprise software too, one other great option and avenue to go down for being able to create a target list is who your partners work with. So if you have a great partner ecosystem as well, and they're already working with similar companies, those partners are fantastic, whether that's any of those consulting firms like Big Four. They help a lot in terms of being able to pull decision makers into those conversations as well. But in terms of actually putting some of the list together, there's a lot of variation here that can take some time. I think what we've talked about, I actually just had a girl on my team that had an amazing win story that she had reached out to somebody literally 100 times over the past year, was brushed off as CFO every single time, finally caved and took the call, was thanking her for it at the end. There is sometimes no like knowing whether it's going to be the first call or the 100th call, and whether and now that's in pipeline for million plus. There's the opportunity for that too, that you just don't know what that process is going to look like. That being said, what we're talking about usually is value has to be in every single touch point that you're doing. We can't just be asking for meetings. One of the things that we always ask about is after you've booked something, why is that prospect excited about that meeting? Why are they even going to show up afterwards? And then when you go and talk to your account executive who's actually going to be holding the meeting, why are they excited to take these calls as well? And if we can't answer those questions, that person's not showing up. So value on every single touch point is what we think about, whether that's a customer story, someone that looks like them, someone that's experiencing the same problems as them. Showing that expertise and understanding where they're coming from is what it's all about.
What are your kind of guidelines around how many total touches? This would be kind of a good thing to go around the group with, actually, around like total number of emails, phone calls, social touches, et cetera. What are you seeing?
Yeah, we look at it in 4 different ways. Every single one of them is important, from calls, emails, marketing events, and social. I think they each provide their own value, whether it's social kind of being like a validation touch, marketing, actual intentional engagement, email where you're really presenting full value, and generally phone calls where you're able to actually hook somebody and be able to pull that all together into a single one. And I think all of them have their own unique value to that. Generally speaking, we're looking at probably 45 days of all of those touch points, and probably looking at about 28 to 30 touches during that time before we go into a nurture sequence and put it off for a minute.
Let's go around the room on that. Megan and Jack on the Zoom info side, what's the guidance around contact strategy and emails, phone calls? There's just like so many people ask questions around is email dead or phone call dead? It's like all of the data supports that, and it has for a very long time, that you should do all of those things. Right. You just right now, I feel like you can't get away with just doing one like you used to be able to. But how do you guys think about, sequence and how prescriptive you get with a rep on the number of outreaches over what period of time, et cetera?
Right. For us over here, at least, I do think it is very important to diversify your outreach. You do want to be multifaceted, because by any means, my reps don't depend on getting all of their meetings booked for the month from emails or from LinkedIn messages or from these supplementary ways that they could be reaching out to people outside of phone call. but it helps. If that means they can get an extra 5 meetings a month from doing a type of outreach that they wouldn't have been doing unless we encourage them to, I think that's the difference maker right there. If you are being so rigid with your reps saying the only thing we're going to do is call, I think that's also eliminating some possible strengths that your reps have, whether people are really good at engaging on LinkedIn or they write phenomenal emails. I suck at email personally. That's just me. That's why, again, another plug for ZoomInfo. We have an AI emailer tool. I use that thing all day long. I recommend my reps to use it. It's taking your brain out of the process, right? But also leaving voicemails. I always think of Brian Vital, one of our executives on the sales side over at ZoomInfo. We were giving him a Q&A one time, and we were asking him, what do you wish people would do more when they cold called you? And he was like, leave voicemails. And we were like, why? And he was like, I get so many calls from so many random numbers day in and day out. And if they were really important and really wanted to actually have a conversation for me, they would tell me who they are. Right? So I think that's super important too. But in terms of timeline for us over here, and it might just be because we have a wealth of different accounts that we can go after. We're not segmented by a certain industry or anything like that over at ZoomInfo, but we're normally giving accounts about a 2-week timeline over here. And the way I would think about engaging, especially over call, is if you're calling Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, the following week. You're hitting them on multiple different days, multiple different times of day. I would encourage you, if your reps are like, my people aren't picking up, are you only calling in the morning? Are you only calling in the afternoon? Or are you diversifying? I think that's the big word to think of. Leaving voicemails, making sure you're connecting on LinkedIn, sending those messages on LinkedIn, sending them, manual emails, or maybe it's an AI email. And then normally after the course of those 2 weeks is when we would put them in a little bit more of a general drip campaign. And then who knows, maybe we might pick back up with those companies in a month or so. It doesn't mean that if we call them for 2 weeks, they're dead and we never want to talk to them again, right? But we want to open that time back up to new companies we can engage with. And the last thing I'll say on this is the importance of multi-threading outbound accounts, right? Especially if you're able to call multiple different personas from a different company. Don't just say that you're going to call one person for 2 weeks every other day. Call 3 people or 4 people at an account. So that way, if someone tells you no, you can at least grab insight from that conversation and bring it to the next person you call. So I think that's super important.
And I will drone on with what you both said, because you're 100% correct. I'll give you one other additional thing to think of as you go through this multi-touch strategy, because that's what you want to do. Think about the story that you're telling as you do it. I see a lot of reps, they go out and they just blast the same, it's the full story about what ZoomInfo does. It just makes a cumbersome email. And if you're not hitting them, you give them every value you have in the first touch point, what are you saying in the other ones? You start to get redundant. So think about the story that you're telling as you go through those touch points. Think about the story that you're telling as you encounter those different stakeholders within the organization, going through those other different personas. So think about organically, just what the hell are you saying? And does it make sense? Because you can give them a bunch of different touch points. They might just not be answering because that doesn't resonate with them. But if then you finally hit the thing that they care about, the thing that really sets the hook with them, all of a sudden they're starting to get traction, starting to respond. So think about that storytelling aspect.
Yeah, I think one of the cool things about voicemail too that Megan hit on it as well is people don't use voicemails the same way they did 5 years ago. They're all transcribed now. You're basically sending someone an email to their phone at this point and making it a super easy way for them to be able to quickly read voicemails rather than actually listening to them. So rather than just being an annoying number that pops up on their phone every other day, there's actually some context and real value that they can easily read and engage with that they don't have to do any more effort for. So I'll just throw that out there as well.
So I have a very different way of looking at it. Jason kind of knows my philosophy around this, but I do it very differently. Now, I do think using multiple channels is effective, But too many times I see companies that roll out these long sequences with multiple different channels, and they're taking one hammer, multiple different nails, and they're hitting each one of them small, and they're not making a lot of progress, and they're wondering why. They're like, hey, I've read every influencer on LinkedIn. I've read every whatever, Agave sequence and stuff. Like, I've tried to build the perfect thing. It's not working. What I generally tell people to do if they're building an outbound team is start with one channel, get that channel to actually work. And a lot of times I will work with a company that's a bit larger, and their emails and their LinkedIn approach is really not working much at all. And the main thing that's driving the vast majority of the results is the cold calling piece. Other times it's totally opposite. They're spending time cold calling. It's not working all of that well, and emails generating done for them. So you have to understand which channel works best for you and the markets that you're reaching out to. And the data is what tells you that. So what you do is you start with one channel. I'm biased. I like cold calls, so I always start with cold calling. I feel cold calling is guaranteed to work, so I always start with it. So if you're not doing anything, I would start there. As you get that workflow down, then I start adding other channels to it. Those other channels may support and make the cold calling better, but if you can't get the foundation of the cold calling working well with the actual workflow of doing the activity, what ends up happening is the reps have all these different things to do, and they end up diverting their attention to what makes them feel the most comfortable, as opposed to what is actually going to work. And since you don't really know, you just sort of let the team do whatever they do, and then they're not performing very well, and you're wondering why. So start with one channel, get that channel working, add a second channel to that first channel, get that working, then add another channel, get that working. That's how I generally recommend building these things before you go whole hog with a whole bunch of different channels and none of them work all that well.
I think Wade hit in the chat too. Like you're getting your actions out of the calls. Like the other things supplement it really well. Like they help tell that story. But when you're looking to book a meeting, you're looking to get on the phone to do so.
Right. And that's true. And also what I would encourage people to do is do the math on the amount of time that your rep spends sending an email and how much it's actually generating for you. You'd be surprised at the amount of money you spend for a cold email booking. When you can automate a lot of that, you can use tools to use AI, like all these to like personalize stuff. Like this is happening at scale all over the place. So I get very, very focused on what my team spends their time on, and am I getting a good return on that time? If you were to shut off your email campaigns today, what impact does that have on the organization? We can all just say, oh, well, we're not going to book an extra small amount of meeting per month, and our cold calls would probably get worse because we're also not emailing them. Really? Let's prove it. Because we say a lot of things, but the data is what tells us what we need to do. So I recommend with everybody, look at the data, run the experiment, shut off emails for a week and see if it hurts cold calling, or 2 weeks or whatever. Like really understand why you're doing these things. Just because somebody on LinkedIn says you need to do it doesn't actually mean that's true. I know plenty of organizations that are doing 20, 30, 50 million in ARR who just cold call. They don't send one cold email. They have a marketing function sending marketing emails, but the bulk of their business comes from cold outreach, and they're calling. That's it. One channel, 50 million in ARR. Other companies, much larger, maybe they're doing multiple channels. I know small companies that are having success with multiple channels. So I'm not saying there's one approach versus the other, but I'm just encouraging everybody here to really spend some time with the data and make the decision based on what you're seeing in your company, because that's ultimately the only way you're going to know what the right approach is.
Love it, dude. Okay, we're going to shift gears, you guys, into the one-on-one portion of the conversation. So Kyle and I are going to have a one-on-one kind of portion here over the next 12, 15 minutes or so. Megan, Jack, Daniel, thanks for coming on, you guys. It's good having you. Let's give them a little shout in the chat if we could.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So Kyle, what I wanted to kind of double click on with you is data is something that you talk about a lot. I think for people, and just to give you guys some perspective, Kyle, he's helped 283 startups scale their outbound motion. So he's done this a lot of times with companies implementing an outbound motion for the first time. So if you have specific questions for Kyle, make sure to drop them into the Q&A. How do you think about outbound from a data standpoint? So the questions that I would be thinking about if I was a founder or a sales leader at a company is, what are kind of the basic bare bones metrics that I should be tracking, like in advance of even starting something like this? And then how would I use that to improve performance and inform coaching efforts and that sort of stuff? How do you think about that piece?
So it all starts with the activities that the reps are doing. Everyone here has heard me talk about this in this call alone. You could tell I'm very, very intentional about how the reps spend their time. And I want to enable that time to be spent on the highest productivity possible. So I start with the activities. What activities are we doing? So you need to be tracking calls. You need to be tracking emails. You need to be tracking LinkedIn, which most of you don't do. You just kind of let it happen, right? Or it's just, it's in outreach as a task and you're not even sure if it really happened or not. Like, you really need to be tracking the channels that you're using. So you have the activities, and then there's the engagements. So the people who answer their phone, the people who reply to an email, reply to you on LinkedIn. That tells us when I do 100 activities, I get engaged with 10 people. 10 people answer the phone, maybe 5 phone, 5 email, whatever it is for you, right? So that's activity, engagement, and then meetings booked, which tells us how effective are our engagements with the prospects. So if you're looking at your email numbers and you have 10 engagement from email, so 10 people replied to your email, and we booked 0 meetings, something's not working right there. And you want to work to improve that. Same thing with cold calls. If we talk to 10 people, we don't book any meetings, why? We need to understand why. So that's the first chunk of data: activities, engagements, meetings booked. Then we go into the actual sales part of the process, which is, did the meeting show up? Did the meeting qualify? And then what was the drop off between each of the deal stages? If you track all of that, you have just about everything you need to identify where the bottlenecks are within your sales process from end to end. And then you can start constructing a hypothesis around how to improve a specific bottleneck. And I'm happy to dive into examples, Jason, but let me just pause there. Anything come up that you want me to double click on?
Yeah, I just want to point out, so I think there's a couple of things here. One, I work with some very large organizations that don't do that middle part of the tracking. Yeah, they have a reply rate to the email, but they aren't like religiously tracking pickup rates. They aren't tracking the booking rate on cold calls. And most of them are not tracking meetings booked by channel. So if you have this, like, I'm tracking effort, I'm tracking the engagement of that effort, and then the results, the meetings booked, it helps you get really prescriptive, not only just as an organization, but with each rep on, you're going to see certain things where certain reps are really good on one channel or the other. And a lot of times I feel like we roll out training across an org and it's very generic and it doesn't help people with the problem that they're actually having. I think the second part is, how do we measure this stuff? I mean, a sales engagement tool is going to give you all of the measurement you need for this, right? I mean, and there's a bunch of different tools that you can use.
Yeah, and you want to double check. Some of them are doing a better job measuring this than others. I have SDRs for the prospecting portion of this. I have them fill out a spreadsheet at the end of every day, telling me how many calls they made, how many emails they sent, how many people answered the phone, how many replies did you get, how many meetings you booked, how many of them actually showed up. How many were scheduled for that day and then how many actually showed up. And I have them fill that out at the end of the day. It's built in a dashboard. So they're actually pulling numbers from a dashboard, just typing it in manually. So it takes them less than 5 minutes. And I do that for 2 reasons. One is because in a spreadsheet, I can run cool calculations and stuff that are a lot harder to do in CRM or sometimes impossible. But then the other reason is it gives ownership of the data to the SDRs. And I get pushback on this where people are like, oh, I don't want my SDRs spending time typing in data points at the end of the day, which I just think is a ridiculous opinion to have. The reality is you need that data in order to enable them to be more effective. And by them taking ownership of that data, they start understanding where they can apply their efforts to make improvements to how they're doing things. So to your point, Jason, like Megan said earlier, she sucks at email. Other people on their team crush at email. I want to learn from those people so Megan can improve and get better at email. And then Megan, she might absolutely clean up on cold calls. She talks to somebody on the phone. Her conversion is so high on getting a meeting. What's she doing differently? And then you start taking that you systematize it, and you roll it out to the rest of the team. And by doing those kind of spot improvements person by person, you'll see the entire team starts to lift up. But more importantly than that, you start building an actual data-driven, data-backed playbook that reps can execute on when they come in. And you know it works because you have the numbers to support it. And then when numbers go way out of whack, since you have so much data, you can really understand why they've gone out of whack, and you can make the improvements from there. So it's critical. The data piece is such an important part. And I feel like it's irresponsible to run a team of salespeople without also having conversations around their metrics and what areas they individually need to focus on to improve their results.
Yep. And I just dropped those numbers again into the chat. The second part of this is, okay, I'm tracking this stuff. The second, I call it the sales math. You basically have to show a reverse engineered version, especially for account executives. Like if you want account executives to self-source pipe and do some stuff along the SDRs, what you're suggesting, correct me if I'm wrong, is we have to be able to show them, hey, you want to close X amount of work from self-source deals. Here's how that goes, like works its way down, all the way down to like literally on a daily basis. Here's how many calls and emails you need to make, versus me pulling a number out of my ass and saying, Kyle, you have to make 200 calls a week. And it's a completely arbitrary number. I think helping the reps figure out this number, it's going to be different for every rep based on their personal conversion rate.
It totally is. And you're right. Like a lot of times we give out like minimums, like 200 calls a week, which I think everyone should have a minimum, but you also need a why. Why is that minimum there? And it's to enable you to hit the number that you're trying to hit. And every rep is going to have a quota that they're trying to hit. And then some reps are going to try to do better than that number, whatever it is for them. But you can work with that rep to, like you said, reverse engineer what they have to do on a daily basis in order to hit that number. But the next level of that is really understanding where the blocker is that's preventing the rep from being as effective as they could. So for example, Jason, as a sales rep, his drop off from deal stage 1, which might be qualification, to deal stage 2, which might be demo, might be really high. And if you don't see that as a problem, or you're not even tracking it at all, you might be playing around with Jason's cold call script or his demo flow. Okay, you need to be doing demo this way, or you need to be trial closing like this, when his problem's actually before that. Right? And that's what's so important about this data side that often gets lost is we bring on sales trainers, which I think is a great thing to do. But we bring on sales trainers and we change scripts. We give objection overcoming materials. We create battle cards for stuff. But not once did the person ask, what are they actually struggling with? We say, oh, we're not closing as many deals as we need to close or that we want to close. The question is, why aren't we? And then you put all your effort into improving that. And that is what actually improves the overall number. By doing other things and not looking at the data, you're just blindly rolling things out, hoping that it works. And that's how you get into these situations where every month or every quarter, there's a new script, there's a new flavor of the month methodology. You don't need that. You just need to know where you need to apply your efforts.
So Scott Huston has an interesting question, and I think I know your answer. But he asked, how do these approaches change if a company is still trying to build its brand rather than calling from a slightly more known entity? So, for example, I'm cold calling and I work at Zoom versus I'm cold calling and working at a startup that no one's ever heard of. Does the approach change at all? So from a data perspective, not really, but your numbers are going to look radically different. And this is why, like I preach use your own numbers. Why I went on that little rant earlier is because you can learn a lot from how ZoomInfo does things. You can learn a lot from how Rippling does things, but they have this brand recognition that is magic. Just to be clear, it's magic. People know who they are when they're calling. They have context. Very different. The conversations are different. The messaging is different. How you approach the market is different. And you can take those strategies, but it's a very different approach on how you would apply those for you. So how does that change from a data perspective? Nothing. Like
Keep all that the same, track all of those things equally, and then be very specific about what challenges you're trying to solve. But what it's going to require you to do is run a lot more experiments on the messaging side. Because the reality is, the earlier stage you are, the less brand recognition you have, the more you're going to have to talk about the problems and the impacts of the problems for that individual, because they're not already categorizing you as a solution to that problem. So your conversations are going to sound a little bit different. ZoomInfo can call, and I get cold calls from ZoomInfo all the time where they're like, hey, I'm calling from ZoomInfo. I want to see if now's a better time for you to evaluate our tool. It's like totally different. So anyway, that's just a little spiel on that, but it is an important thing to know.
Yeah, and then lean into where you have social proof also, and being really just hyper targeted and niche. Okay, we have got time for one question. Sadie Ledwig asks, you mentioned outbound derived deals usually beat inbound derived deals in most ways, but we're finding that outbound derived deals have longer sales cycles. Yeah. Do you think that that is a list or targeting problem? We use 6 Sense to identify high intent accounts, but sales cycles are still roughly double. I'd love your take on like intent data too.
Yeah, I don't like intent data. I like the website visitor stuff, but as far as like, oh, we have signals that they're Googling this stuff, I've seen it be marginal at best at improving outreach. I have one situation where it worked really well for somebody. Other than that, it's always been So not the biggest fan of it, but I think it's worth experimenting with. I want to comment on that though. So there's 2 things that could possibly going on. Could the targeting be somewhat of an issue? I'm not sure. Generally, it's more about how in market the person is. And when somebody comes inbound, they've already sort of shown the intent that this is a problem that they're looking to solve. So they're going to move a lot quicker to solve that problem because it's very top of mind. Versus outbound, you're really helping them navigate how important solving that problem is, and also trying to build some of that urgency or that momentum that you're not starting with. So inbound starts with more momentum from the prospect side than outbound does. But what I also see is that sales reps who handle inbound leads sometimes don't do great, or often, mostly, they don't do great working outbound leads. So it could actually be a sales training problem or sales rep problem where they just don't have the skills to navigate outbound sales because it requires a bit more. You
got to be better at sales to close out deals.
What was that?
You just got to be better at sales to close out.
Yeah, I mean, like there is a sense of that where it's like, when you don't have that urgency, you need to be able to build it, right? And not everybody has that skill.
No, totally. So,
actually,
Kyle,
real quick, Jason, I know we're based on that time, but right before, and just so everybody hears this from me, I have always seen a big lift in outbound like meeting setting and in deal closing from splitting the team, outbound and inbound. So if you have the volume to support like 1 or 2 people full time, if you're earlier stage on just inbound, 100% do it. And then have an outbound team separate. I've always seen that improve results. If it's blended, it doesn't convert as well.
Well, I think what's tough too is, look, if you're traditionally inbound led and you're trying to do more outbound, the people that were really good at inbound might not be the same people that are going to help you with this outbound thing. Like that's one of the biggest mistakes I see, is trying to force people that came into the company expecting to do inbound that really don't want to do outbound and hate outbound, and trying to get them to do it. They just might not be the right fit. Kyle, thanks for coming on today. That was super valuable. Go check out Orum, ZoomInfo if you guys are looking for more tools and things like that to help you out. And that's all I got for you guys today. Appreciate the engagement and showing up, everyone. And we'll see you next time. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Later, everyone.